I'm going to say, if you want to find out what's really going on, stick with UK column. And Alex Thompson wrote an excellent article, Fake News and Impartial Inquiry. I'll bring in Melanie Shaw at this point because, of course, Melanie Shaw has never been covered properly by the BBC. They did an initial report on abuse in Beechwood, and as soon as Melanie and other child abuse survivors started to talk about the real truth of the abuse and the involvement of Westminster, and the names of politicians were mentioned, the BBC simply withdrew and no longer reported. So children are certainly not going to be taught about the quality of the politicians running the country. Well, this is just it for Brexit, isn't it? The British public takes the lies and the false media, and behind the scenes they're going rapidly ahead with EU military unification. Isn't this what it's about, David?
Correct. There is only one critical thing to be established and sorted at the moment within this framework of what people are saying is Brexit, and then the only trade deal in town is EU military unification, EU military union. And that is the big deal. It's the must-have. They must have it in order to secure their treasury so they can tax everyone and take ownership of everyone's defence assets. So the PESCO framework, which is what they're doing there in hand in glove with NATO. So obviously EU and NATO are now the same thing. That's very obvious because they're stood next to each other. And the reason Boris is very quiet, he's like some sort of SR-71 stealth minister, radar avoiding, because he doesn't want any of this in the news. He does not want the British people having any idea that their military is about to be
subsumed,
taken into EU military union with absolutely no debate, no mandate, no vote, no scrutiny. Now, there was not a amendment or a subsection on the Brexit ballot paper that kept the military separate. You know, it was, did you want to leave the EU or did you want to remain? So this is an appeal I'm putting out to both camps, so the Remainers as well as the Brexiteers. Were you consulted in any way, shape or form that the military would be treated separately, and the industry that goes hand in glove with it? So that's BAE, Babcock, Rolls-Royce, all of it, all the decent stuff. Now let's take it a step further. So the big questions in NATO are obviously the French and British nukes. Now, we've already heard Theresa May talk about, well, our nuclear deterrent, our independent nuclear deterrent, that, by the way, Parliament has just voted to renew, is that...
We're going to lose him, I think.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're back.
Okay, is that they've going to think that they can barter seats at the EU military union table with our quality, and the quality is the boats and the bombers, Aldermaston, and the production of our nuclear weapons. And I understand that there are a new series of weapons being produced as we speak, and obviously the production at Barrow-in-Furness. So these are the quality items that are being horse traded at the moment, ultimately in these arrangements that are going on. So NATO is the conduit, and the EU are sort of, very cleverly here using NATO as the conduit in order to get French and British nukes. It's as simple as that. And that's what we need to start talking about. Everybody needs to start talking about that and going to your MP. What's going on with this?
Well, we better end on the subject that, according to the BBC, at least, there's been a death threat against our Prime Minister.
Much more than that. Apparently, they were going to blow up the gates of number 10 Downing, the gates on the way up to Downing Street, and then they were going to run in the chaos and stab her.
And presumably the BBC put the evidence for this plot forward, did they, Mike?
It's gone to court, so I'm sure the evidence will come out in due course, but I'm not certain that there's any tangible evidence there.
Okay. Well, we didn't detect a lot of sympathy from members of the public who talked to us about what's happening. So we'll wait with great interest, but I see that the security services are using this for more self-publicity to say how many plots they foiled this year, but they just don't tell the public the facts about those plots. That must be a good industry to be in. We've done really well, so well, we can't tell you what we've done. Now, let's end on a positive note. Many people are now seeing the picture as to what is happening in UK, the deliberate breakdown of society. This is happening as a result of policy. People are making that policy, and it's becoming increasingly easy to see who those people are. But the key things that we need to focus on are common law, constitution, and really the creation and control of money. So if you want to start out researching, suggest you look at those areas, and these are the areas that we need to inform and educate not only our children but adults in the wider population, because these are the issues we need to get to grips with to deal with the criminality in Westminster.
What did the BBC have to say? Well, here we go. We have a giant cake of the ship, and it does have aircraft, Brian. So that's one thing. That's good.
This is really terrible. What's going on, Mike? Because all those young men and women who working so hard, dedicated within the military, being utterly betrayed. They've no idea about what's taking place around them. But of course, the government is drastically cutting Britain's military. So that aircraft carrier, or the two aircraft carriers, don't have the escorts capable of providing them with the defence they need. It isn't just a question of putting an aircraft carrier to sea on its own. It's got to have the support of other ships and submarines around it. That support doesn't exist. And they use the Royal Marine Band for the ceremony, whilst the government, of course, is stabbing the Royal Marines in the back once again by looking to cut their numbers further and to sell off our amphibious capability. And I think you mentioned that one of the ships, Ocean, was going to Brazil.
It's going to Brazil. It's been sold, I think, for 50 million. But of course, they're getting rid of the amphibious capability, and we're going to borrow ships from the French.
Are we going to borrow ships from the French? We are going to be told, well, we can only work fully integrated with the EU military forces. So this is a complete lie by the government over Brexit. It's treason upon the nation, in that the government has cut our defences to the point where we cannot defend ourselves. That is treason, or at least high treason. And those young men and women simply being used as props in this huge political agenda. I think it's disgusting.
Yeah,
well,
pretty cynical. Now, yesterday we saw a man in court who was accused of having plotted to blow up the gates at the end of Downing Street, and then in the ensuing chaos, to attempt to stab Theresa May. Today, the news is that another terrorist suspect is in court, and apparently he urged jihadists to kill Prince George. So, Brian, I wonder how far this has to go. I mean, it's speechless, because, you know, how far do these stories, how extreme do these stories have to become before people sort of say it's enough?
Well, I think people can keep saying it's enough, but until we get to the heart of the matter, that this is a mixture of truth, spin, and government propaganda in order to achieve an agenda. And the agenda is fear. The population is to be kept in a permanent state of fear that we are going to be murdered in our beds by these jihadis. And the jihadis are so powerful, of course, they can bring down buildings in the States from their caves in Afghanistan, or they can be running amok to conquer the Middle East. But not to worry, because our new Defence Secretary says that we're going to kill them.
My question is, if we funded ISIS, which we seem to have done, what is this actually about? Is this about making sure that terrorists don't come back to this country to maim and kill? Or is this about making sure that anybody that was involved in ISIS in Syria on the receiving end of UK Foreign Office and Department for International Development money can't come back to talk about it?
In that dead men tell no tales. Well, as always, Mike, you're straight into the subject matter here. Let's just bring our old friend Michael Fallon back on screen, because of course a little while ago he was saying exactly the same thing. We need to kill them. Let's kill them all. Fascinating man, former Minister for War, as we like to call them, rather than Defence Secretary. But his expertise was in children's nurseries. Of course, British military ripped apart while he was in post. But 1 minute he's looking after little children in nurseries. That's his professional expertise. But the rest of it is kill them, kill them. So you were absolutely right, and I've put quite a lot of detail on screen here because I think it's worthwhile. But here's the headline. This is going back in 2011. Libyan terror suspect put in charge of guarding David Cameron on 2011 Tripoli visit. So we've got a Libyan terror suspect who was imprisoned in UK, was put in charge of guarding David Cameron. It said that Mr. Cameron, who was then Prime Minister, visited Tripoli along with French President Sarkozy in September 2011. The security was provided by the Libyan national previously regarded as a terror suspect in the UK. The man's identity was protected by the British legal system. He was given the identifying letter M in court cases after being detained in Belmarsh jail as a suspected terrorist in the wake of the 9/11 attacks in the US. M was a prominent leader in the Libyan Islamic fighting group LIFG, a banned terror organisation of which Abdi's father was also a prominent supporter. LIFG was accused of strong links to Al-Qaeda. So we're going to kill them all, except where the British government has actually conveniently been using the terrorists to foment its own wars in Libya and elsewhere. And if necessary, we're happy to have those terrorists protect British Prime Ministers such as David Cameron.
Well, that's interesting because the BBC used terrorists to protect them when they were in Syria.
Indeed, they did.
That's a coincidence.
It's just a coincidence. We're going to encourage people to have a look at the UK column website. This is one of the news editions that covered this subject from the 4th of December. So if you'd like to know more on how the British government funds terror, have a look at that particular news edition. Where do we go?
Well, Israel. So many people were waiting with bated breath for what Theresa May might say about Donald Trump's decision to make Jerusalem the capital of Israel, or at least to approve that, to suggest that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. That statement finally came out late yesterday. She said, "We disagree with the US decision to move its embassy to Jerusalem and recognize Jerusalem as the Israeli capital before a final status agreement. We believe it is unhelpful in terms of prospects for peace in the region. The British embassy to Israel is based in Tel Aviv, and we have no plans to move it. Our position on the status of Jerusalem is clear and long-standing. It should be determined in a negotiated settlement between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and Jerusalem should ultimately be the shared capital of the Israeli and Palestinian states. In line with the relevant Security Council resolutions, we regard East Jerusalem as part of the occupied Palestinian territories. We share Donald Trump's desire to bring an end to this conflict. We welcome his commitment today to a two-state solution negotiated between the parties, and note the importance of his clear acknowledgement that the final status of Jerusalem, including the sovereign boundaries within the city, must be subject to the negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians." Well, as most people will probably be aware, Benjamin Netanyahu is now attempting to persuade lots of other global leaders to back up Donald Trump and support this decision. But there's been a lot of discussion about, what Trump was thinking about when he announced this. Was this just the influence of the Israeli lobby on him? Is he being blackmailed? Was this Jared Kushner up to his tricks? Or is there something else going on? We know that Trump likes to throw grenades in and see what comes out. If there's a situation which is intractable, he tends to throw a grenade in and see what comes out. I don't know the answer to that. Nobody that I know, nobody that I've spoken to particularly knows the answer to that. But this morning, this piece of news came out that Saudi Arabia describes Jerusalem decision as irresponsible and unjustified. And this is quite interesting because Saudi Arabia and Israel have been getting very, very close recently. And if this splits that sort of friendship which seems to be building there, then maybe that is the target of this particular move. I don't think we know the answer just yet, and we need to wait and see over the next couple of weeks what might transpire.
Well, that's absolutely true. My key question, Mike, would be in making these statements, is Theresa May working for the British nation, or is she actually acting for Israel itself? Because we have this huge problem with a massive pro-Israeli lobby in Westminster, the Conservative Friends of Israel, We've had David Cameron saying that his loyalty to Israel was unshakable. That to me means that the British people came second to his links to Israel. And we've had Theresa May standing up, of course, and saying that she is also absolutely for Israel. And we have a huge amount of Israeli money coming into the Conservative Party itself. So who is she speaking for? Is she speaking for the British people or Israel?
It's a good question because when I read the press release, I thought the statement was pretty soft. It took them a long time to produce that. So whereas normally she would be attacking Trump for everything that he does, in this case she hasn't.
Yeah.
She's been quite, well, as far as she's able to go, apparently she's been quite supportive of it. So it's a good question to ask.
Well, let's come back to the subject of the BBC. We've been reporting a lot on the BBC over the last couple of days, and it just gets better. So thank you very much to the lady who said, were we aware of this? And the answer was we weren't. So the Daily Post reporting that the BBC will create a pool of more than 140 local democracy reporters to cover council and public meetings for news organisations across the UK, including the Daily Post itself. And there'll be a total of 144 full-time and 2 part-time local democracy reporters. And they've been allocated to 58 news organisations in England, Scotland and Wales, following a competitive bidding process. So we were fascinated by this. If you research, you'll find that there were the first glimpses of this about a year ago, but let's have a look at the comments around this. We've got David Holdsworth here. He's shortly to leave the BBC, but at the moment he's BBC controller of the English regions. And what does he have to say? Well, he says this is a major advance in the partnership which will significantly improve the reporting on councils and public institutions, leading to greater public accountability for our local politicians. So this is all about a partnership, working together, getting those news teams to get even tighter in bed. But it's going to be good for us because we're going to get effectively better reporting on what councils and public bodies are doing, and it's going to hold the politicians to account. So Mike, you've got a warm feeling at this stage, I would imagine.
Yeah, but it's running down my leg, Brian, because this is unbelievably dangerous. So what we have here is the removal of any kind of competition between media organisations.
Yeah.
We have local media, which has been decimated in recent years, local newspapers bought up by 1 or 2 big organisations, and now we're going to get rid of all the local court reporters, all the local council reporters, and we're going to replace those with an outsourced agreement with the BBC. So there's only one voice. If we turn on the television, we get one voice, that's the BBC. We turn on the radio, we get one voice, it's the BBC. And now local reporting is going to be one voice, the BBC.
But worse than that, because it may appear that it's not one voice. You will be getting one voice through a different name, which is highly deceptive. So you could be listening to a local news station, which is not the BBC. Unbeknown to you, the news is the BBC. Well, let's bring in more personalities because they're the key to understanding this. We've got Ashley Highfield here, very high-flying man, chairman of the News Media Association. Previously, he was a director on the BBC board himself. So I think he spent 8 years with the BBC, but presumably he's now independent. He says the groundbreaking local news partnership between the NMA and the BBC is now becoming a reality which will benefit the BBC local media and, most importantly, local communities. It's all about us, Mike.
Yeah.
The initiative has moved the whole relationship between the BBC and the local media sector from confrontation to collaboration. And key benefits will include 150 new journalists on the ground holding public institutions to account on behalf of their readers. So it's the news media grouping up and collaborating, but don't worry, it's all for our benefit. Well, have a look at this man. This is obviously his Twitter page. You can see some of his previous jobs. He was with Microsoft, MD, Microsoft UK for a while. That's pretty interesting. That gets you into the big players. And there he was a board director with the BBC for 8 years. So let's put this together over the last few days. We've had the BBC basically coming in and setting up its BBC The name has gone out of my head.
Reality check?
Reality check. Thank you very much, Mike. BBC Reality Check, to check what the truth is. We've got the BBC coming into schools to teach children how they need to be watching the BBC. And then, of course, the BBC is running its own propaganda, as we showed with Brexit. So we're going to say there that the BBC is setting up its own truth and propaganda organisation. Now, let's put this lot into context, because 8 million from the licence payers' money is setting up this new partnership with News Media Association. They set up this local partnership, and we've already heard what's in that. We've got 700 media organisations signed up to it, 700. And what's going to be happening? Well, they're going to be setting up a shared data unit based at BBC Birmingham, and that's going to give local news providers access to BBC video and audio content, and it's going to be developing what they call data journalism expertise. So they're all working together, sharing BBC material. Why produce it yourself, Mike, if you can simply crib the BBC reports? And what have we got here? The pool of 144 part-time local democracy reporters. Straight out of 1984, that language, isn't it? Local democracy reporters. They produce stories that get fed back into that partnership scheme. And if we go on down, we've got 24 contracts issued to employ 55 titles for Trinity Mirror. So is this the BBC that you're now working with, watching, or is it Trinity Mirror? And the final bit at the bottom of your screen is that news organisations, radio stations, online media companies and established regional newspaper groups will receive funding from the BBC for employment costs of the reporters. So it's almost like the BBC is now starting to buy up commercial media.
I would like to know where in the BBC Charter it says that this type of commercial arrangement is permitted.
Well, they've apparently got a special bit in the Charter, Mike, which says that they are basically able to give this money. So I think they've preempted your question by changing the Charter to make this acceptable. I put a tag on that image, which was basically BBC tightens the noose around the neck of independent news reporting. That's absolutely true. But let's also remember that in the background, we've got the government that is running the largest applied behavioural psychology agenda probably seen in the West. So this came out of this government's so-called nudge unit, but this was the government boasting in their document Mindspace that they could change the way people thought and behave by using applied psychology, and the public wouldn't even realise it's happening. So this is big society, and what do you need for big society? Well, you need a massive propaganda organisation. And we'll just give you this bit on the News Media Association. If you say, what is it? Well, this probably is about the best you're going to get, because it's the voice of national, regional and local news media organisations in the UK, a 5 billion sector, 48 million adults look at the material. But it says the NMA exists to promote the interests of news media publishers to government, regulatory authorities, industry bodies and other organisations whose work affects the industry. This is nothing about the viewer. This is about these organisations being able to get into the market and simply make more money.
So, Brian, the whole of EU law
and new law.
I think this is what we've been saying.
Well, so absolutely no change. There is no Brexit. We're locked in at law with the EU, and if they produce new law, we're locked into that new law as well.
So at this point, he's saying this is for the transition period of about 2 years, but we're not exactly sure how long the transition period is going to be, because that hasn't actually been negotiated yet. They haven't started that negotiation. That's going to start now. So will it be 2 years? Will it be 5 years? Will
2 years negotiation about how long the negotiation period will take?
Well, no, apparently they claim that it's going to be a 1 year negotiation, because we've still got this deadline of March 2019 that we're actually leaving on. But then we've got to work out how long the transition period is going to be. So what we've got now is a close UK-EU partnership, Brian, in the areas of trade, Europol, which is effectively what he's saying there, and also military union. These are the three key areas that we've been saying are the three areas which would make any idea of Brexit a nonsense, because if we opt into those, then there are terms and conditions that come with those, and those terms and conditions would have to be reflected in UK law. So what has been agreed? Well, here is the document, and let's have a look at the key paragraph here. It says the United Kingdom remains committed to protecting North-South cooperation. This is all to do with the Northern Irish border. Any future arrangements must be compatible with these overarching requirements. The United Kingdom's intention is to achieve these objectives through the overall EU-UK relationship. Should this not be possible, the United Kingdom will propose specific solutions to address the unique circumstances of the island of Ireland. In the absence of agreed solutions, the United Kingdom will maintain full alignment with the rules of the internal market and the customs union, which now or in the future support North-South cooperation. So both parties have reached an agreement in principle across protecting the rights of union citizens, European Union citizens in the UK and UK citizens in the Union. So we've got free movement of people still. We've got a framework for addressing the unique circumstances of Northern Ireland, which is on the screen at the moment. And we've got the financial settlement, which at this point is not made public, so it's undefined. It goes on to say, following this paragraph, in the absence of agreed solutions, as set out in the previous paragraph, the United Kingdom will ensure that no new regulatory barriers develop between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom. So it is actually just as we've suggested. The Northern Ireland border has been used as an excuse to create a new partnership, a customs partnership. And what the DUP managed to do by putting the kibosh on the previous agreement, because I believe that what Theresa May wanted to do was she was hoping to be able to sell the idea that Britain would be fully out of the single market and the customs union with special rules for Northern Ireland, which would allow some kind of PR fudge to get through this business of whether or not there would be free movement of people and so on. But what's been agreed now is that the rules that apply to Northern Ireland actually have to apply to the whole of the UK. And what's also been agreed is that the European Court of Justice is going to have jurisdiction over all this for at least 8 years, Brian. Yeah, for at least 8 years.
So we adhere to the European laws that exist. We adhere to the new laws. We adhere to the customs union. We adhere to the European security policy. We adhere to EU military unification. We are in the EU, we're staying in the EU, and it's obvious to see.
Absolutely. So who's responsible for this? Let's ask Donald Tusk again.
While being satisfied with today's agreement, which is obviously the personal success of Prime Minister Theresa May, let us remember that the most difficult challenge is still ahead.
So Theresa May has to take personal responsibility for this. He says it's her personal success. It's fantastic. Yeah. So the European Council, at least, and the EU, absolutely supporting her in her position. They don't want her removed, it seems.
No, Treason May is the name, Mike. It's treason. We're watching treason.
So it's probably not a surprise then that when David Davis was interviewed by Hilary Benn at the Select Committee a couple of days ago, that he said this.
So the government hasn't undertaken any impact assessments on the implications for leaving the EU for different sectors of the British economy. So there isn't one, for example, on the automotive sector.
On the
automotive sector?
No, not I'm aware of, no.
Is there one on aerospace?
Not I'm aware of,
no. One on financial services?
Well, I think the answer is going to be no to all of them.
No to all of them, right. Now, doesn't it strike you, Secretary of State, as rather strange, given experience around the committee in which you have, the government undertakes impact assessments on all sorts of things all of the time, that on the most fundamental change that we are facing as a country, you've just told us that the government hasn't undertaken any impact assessments at all.
So it's really only a surprise that the government hasn't carried out any impact assessments at all. if the government is fully aware that there's no requirement to have impact assessments, because actually the situation isn't going to change significantly at all.
Well, you could come on that angle, Mike. The other thing you could say is, well, of course they couldn't do any impact assessments, because if you do an impact assessment, you actually have to be very specific in saying what the change is, what the status quo at the moment is, what the changes are you're proposing. So the deeper the impact assessment, the more the public's going to be able to see what the scam is. They couldn't do it, in my opinion, because it would show the public the whole thing is a complete scam. There is no Brexit. Okay, well, let's get to the heart of the matter, and that's EU military unification. We're going to say that we're extremely pleased that our submission to the Defence Committee, led by David Ellis, but Alex, you've also had input. I've had a little bit of input. This document has finally got through, because I understand that initially the secretaries of the Defence Committee were a little bit confused as to whether they'd received it or not, although they had in fact signed for it. So if you haven't seen that paper yet, this is the header for it, and it is available on the UK Column website. Tell us a bit more about this, and then we'll have a look at a little bit of the detail in diagram form.
It's something that must be read from beginning to end. It's on the front page of the website and should be shared liberally. This is exactly what was sent to the committee by recorded delivery a Monday week ago. And by the end of that week, they were telling David Ellis, the clerks of the committee, that they could neither confirm nor deny receipt of it. But Dr. Lewis was out of the office that day. Now I think David Ellis has, well, he's always very good at making his calculations. He's decided now is the time to go public. So we've put the text of this out. Now we know that the committee's received it. Whether they wish to admit it into their documentation or not is another matter. The public needs to know this as well, and we have named the individuals involved there as well, particularly the FCO Director, Angus Lapsley, and the MOD Director, Dr. Brian Wells, of shady past, to say the least, who is double-hatted. He's MOD, and he's also a Director appointed by Mrs. Mogherini 2 years ago of the European Defence Agency. And these are the Sir Humphreys who have been stymieing Brexit in defence, and particularly defence procurement in the case of Dr. Wells at the MOD.
Now, as a result of all that and everything that's going on, Brian, today we have a tweet going out from the First Sea Lord saying, today I was able, that would be yesterday, I was able to thank my French counterpart, Admiral Christophe Prazouk, for the support the Marine Nationale has given Royal Navy as we regenerate our carrier skills. With the arrival of HMS Queen Elizabeth, a new era of UK-French carrier cooperation awaits.
Yeah, well, this is just disgraceful, and the First Sea Lord should be ashamed of himself. We've had to go grovelling to the French because, of course, the British government scrapped our existing aircraft carriers. Not only did we lose the ships, of course, we lost the expertise of the men and women who were on board those ships, the training and the ability to operate aircraft. So we've had those British service personnel from the Royal Navy have had to go on board French aircraft carriers, supposedly to learn their trade. I just find it, I think I'll stop there because I'm likely to say a word that I'm not allowed to use on UK Column. But Admiral Philip Jones should be ashamed of himself. And of course, it was his colleagues who had meetings with the French where they decided that this scam was going to be put together, and they did it in plain clothes. They did not wear their uniforms, they wore lounge suits, and in my personal opinion, this was treason behind closed doors at the British ambassador's residence in Paris. So let's have a look at how the machinery works, and the submission to the Defence Committee outlines this. I'm going to hand over to Alex just after I've run through the main points here, but the organisation we're looking at is the Defence Suppliers Forum, DSF. This is linked into the International Strategy Forum, ISF. And what's all this about? Well, this is a closed group with membership by the official defence, with membership, I should say, of the official Defence Suppliers Forum arrangements. And ISF's membership is selected by the Secretary of State for Defence. So this is a very circular little plot. as we see already. So what can we say? Well, the International Strategy Forum, co-chaired by Dr. Brian Wells, MOD Director of Science and Technology, also tied into the Director of European Defence Agency. So here's the European angle. We come off in the other direction, give you a bit more detail about the connections through to the sorry, I beg your pardon there, the ADS organisation, and that's the premier trade organisation for companies in the UK, aerospace, defence, security and space sectors. And the connection is that ISF is a group member of ADS, and ADS then has a policy group, if I can pop that on, which provides advice to the ICF and ADS. Now, if you think this is complex, in my opinion, it's designed to be to confuse the public and to stop you seeing what's happening. But in the top left-hand corner, we're going to introduce the Norway model. This is where the Norwegians have been caught up in this system, and we can see that we are now also being forced in this direction. So we've got the EU Common Security and Defence Policy, CSDP, we've got the EU Defence Procurement Arrangements, we've got the EU Agreements, SDIP, EDAP, and we've got the European Defence Fund. But let's put the icing on the cake. Who's connected back into this? None other than Juncker's via his private office. Alex, this is, what do we describe? This is subversion, in my opinion. Our national institutions have been infiltrated and taken over by a foreign power, the European Union.
Yes, and if we just keep that slide on a moment because of the complexity of it, that last arrow you put in, Juncker's private office, we must stress, and we do so in the text of the submission, that is the only one we don't have documentation for, so we're suggesting very strongly that's the case. The rest is confirmed by David making his phone calls. Now, just with this on screen, the point is the DSF, and it's particularly the subgroup, the ISF, is supposedly defence industry advising the Secretary of State for Defence, so now Gavin Williamson, but through most of this, of course, it was Mr. Nurseries. They advise on what they are prepared to accept and what they wish to see for the future of British defence industry, which of course guarantees the future of our military and our sovereignty. But the trouble is that this board has been stuffed with these people from the top right, the ADS, the trade organisation with the dodgy website. And when David Ellis did his phone calls, he got particularly through to a lady called Kellyanne Conway, who said, oh yes, I tell the DSF what line to take and how to advise the Secretary of State for Defence on what to accept in defence integration and the defence future, industrial defence future. Trouble is, Kellyanne Conway's last job was head of international relations for the Labour Party. The other chap David Ellis spoke to there, Mr. Sinclair, was previously advisor to a front bencher for Labour who was completely in favour of defence industry integration with Europe. So you see what's going on there, and at the highest level of it on the MOD side, because the FCO has its own closed loop with Angus Lapsley, who only came in mid-career into the FCO. He's really a Tony Blair loyalist. The MOD side with Dr. Brian Wells, who, by the way, was Kelly's boss at the time of Dr. David Kelly's death. You can read a lot about that. Dr. Brian Wells has these underlings who came across straight from the Labour Party in order to advise him on what to say in this closed loop. No membership can be, no public availability of membership to any old defence industry. It has to be the right people. They tell the Secretary of State what to do. So this loop closes us into the Norway model, just as we were talking a few minutes ago, with effectively the Norway or the membership of the European Economic Area, the EEA, being a predetermined outcome, the Norway option again, in the customs and single market terms, particularly customs, because Norway has got a pro-EU government and an anti-EU population like Britain, particularly England, and this is the stitch-up they've done there. And I've had sources telling me that the same thing is going on on the civilian and customs channels. The Norway option is the predetermined conclusion. That is what has been stitched up for us. At the end of this, we're going to be in the customs union and not going to be able to trade on our own terms with the rest of the world.
Yeah. Well, you tweeted this out earlier, and these are the two that you've been talking about, Angus Lapsley on the left and Dr. Brian Wells on the right.
Yeah, these are the men, and they need a lot of pressure on them now. I've got my old civil service people, most of them have shunned me now, starting with unfriending me on Facebook, but never mind. That whole generation has absolutely blinkered views, and they just want their pensions, I'm afraid. These guys need hammering. politely and democratically, and to be asked repeatedly where their loyalties and particularly their expertise comes from. It's bad enough to have learned your skills in Mr. Lapley's case at the knee of Mrs. Mogherini's service with no prior defence and security expertise, but that's bad enough. But then, where's your expertise coming from, and where are your loyalties? And if you tie those two together, really, you're a very dangerous individual and not fit to be a top-ranking civil servant.
Alex, thank you. And for our viewers, if you want to research into this, and we encourage you to do that, here's ADS's website. You can read about ADS and what they say about themselves. You can also get into the Defence Suppliers Forum through the government's website and have a look at the list of names and companies involved. As I've said here, it's hard to tell whether you're dealing with government or the civil service or big business. This is something extraordinary unfolding here. Britain as a nation state is being taken apart.
And in the meantime, the drive for United States of Europe continues. And Martin Schulz tweeted out yesterday, I think, I want a new constitutional treaty to establish the United States of Europe, a Europe that is no threat to its member states, but a beneficial addition. And that was followed up with a tweet saying a convention to draft this treaty in close cooperation with civil society and the people. Its results will then be submitted to all member states. Any states that won't ratify this treaty will automatically leave the EU.
So there you have it. The United States of Europe is coming. It's coming by 2025. That was the date he chose. And it's going to be worked out by a constitutional convention that they'll set up to discuss it with civil society, bypassing national governments, who will then be offered a take it or leave it deal with expulsion from the EU as a penalty for saying no. So that's, well, it's certainly much clearer. It wasn't much clearer on the BBC. The BBC reported this simply as Martin Schulz making a speech in which he agreed to negotiate with Merkel about forming a new government. You know, they never mentioned United States of Europe once. Isn't that remarkable? The Telegraph did, and I thought this was really one of the most wonderful paragraphs I've ever read in the Telegraph. They quote Martin Schulz, I want a new constitutional treaty to establish the United States of Europe, a Europe that is no threat to its member states, but a beneficial addition. And they then comment under Mr. Schulz's proposal, Brussels would be given power over individual member states' foreign and domestic policy, as well as taxes. So that's no threat, is it?
No, it isn't. No, it isn't. What else do we need to be fully locked into the European Union? Well, it's armed police. Those armed police are coming. David, you've been talking about what's been happening in this respect north of the border, but here we are. We've got the scam that we now need to arm rural police forces because they can't get the armed response teams to any location fast enough in view of this horrific terrorist threat. So the armed police coming in, no debate in Parliament. They need the armed police because that is the routine in Europe. And what sort of country is Britain? Well, we just mentioned Boris because Mike has been leading a search party for Boris Johnson. We now know that he's on his way to Iran. He's there to help the lady journalist who's been locked up. And I just wanted to put Melanie Shaw alongside. Boris Johnson can travel to Iran because a journalist has been locked up, but absolute no interest from the Conservative government to a child abuse whistleblower who's been locked up in prison and abused in Britain. So can we expect the BBC to report? Yesterday we took the lid off the BBC's media collaboration network and pointed out that the BBC was going to be paying the salaries of, for example, Trinity Mirror journalists to report on democracy. We felt a lot safer, didn't we, Mike, on hearing that? And it's reality, because here we have Cornwall Live boasting that it's now using the BBC in pioneering work to report democracy. And there in the photo are a group of people being told what is going to happen, whether they like it or not. And of course, that's reported as democracy.
Well, okay. Someone who is not ever going to appear on the BBC is Vanessa Beeley. So a bit of an advertisement here. She is going to be on Going Underground tomorrow on RT. It's going to be broadcast, I think, 3 or 4 times during the day, so it's on various times. Do watch that if you get a chance, because Vanessa will be going into the funding of the use of taxpayers' money to support Al-Qaeda related organisations in some detail, and she'll be producing some information that hasn't been seen before. Brian, so
well done, Vanessa.
Yes,
well done, Vanessa.
Yes. Now let's move on to Scotland just briefly. A blow for the SNP as the in-person plan is delayed once again. You seem the note in the in-person scheme seems to be doing pretty well at the moment, David.
Oh yes, they're having to get used to winning. This is very strange for any organisation that's taking on the state, because it's such an unequal fight. But what's happened here is the politicians have eventually got on board. The opposition politicians, for assorted reasons, not necessarily ones of great principle, have decided to vote against the latest patch of the government scheme to steal everyone's information and surveil the entire nation. And they've not passed this bill through a committee stage. This has never happened before in the Scottish Parliament. Completely unprecedented. No one really knows what to do. But it would appear that until they get more information, there is a full explanation as to how the scheme is going to work via a code of practice, which won't be ready until late 2018 at the earliest, that the whole thing is stuck. So again, this is a 2014 Act originally. We still wait, and there's more delay, but it's positive that the legislation has not been put in force, because it will further undermine the rights of people in Scotland. But you have to remember that the actual data sharing is going on all the time illegally, so that's a separate fight. Now, just a little comment on how much all of this is costing. The government, having lost so badly, had to pay not only their own legal bill, but the legal bill of the No to Name Person campaign. So that's £800,000 of taxpayers' money down the giant memory hole, and that's a small amount compared to the overall cost of this scheme so far, which is, I understand, sitting around 60 million. 60 million squandered, not on looking after children, but on trying to introduce a surveillance state.